Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is our quarterly webinar where we review last quarter's activity in the voluntary carbon market and feature curated insights from the Trove research team. My name is Irina Badalska, Chief Commercial Officer at Trove Research, and I will be your host today. Our speakers for today's webinar include our CEO and founder, Guy Turner, Senior Analyst Laura Buenventura, Head of Carbon Market Analytics, Peter Fagelman, Senior Analyst Jamie Lambert and Juana Hernandez, and our Head of Policy, Lucian Georgeson. Before we begin, I would like to go over some housekeeping rules. For the structure of the webinar, we will begin with a presentation from the Trove team, followed by a short Q&A at the end. All attendees will be automatically muted. If you have any questions during this presentation, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the window. The slides from today's webinar, together with the recording of the session, will be published on our website by the end of the week, so you'll be able to share them with your colleagues. Today, we will start by looking at some key developments in the voluntary carbon market in the third quarter of this year, followed by an overview from our policy team on how governments around the world are reshaping the voluntary carbon market landscape. We will conclude the webinar with some key takeaways that we believe should be on everyone's radar in Q4 in the lead up to 2024. Following the presentation, we will launch an audience poll, giving you the opportunity to share your thoughts on what the price of carbon credits will be at the end of this year. We'll wrap up the session with a Q&A session. I will now hand over to our founder and CEO, Guy Turner. Guy, over to you.
So great to see you all here, or have everybody connected again. For those who are new to these quarterly webinars, and I know that we have a loyal following, just a few quick words on who we are and what we do. Trove Research is a multi sector research and data company focused on carbon credit markets. We have dedicated teams that track corporate climate commitments and actions, credit prices in the market, voluntary carbon market forecasts, the policy landscape that is shaping this space, and we'll talk more about that. We track every project that issues credits, and our team that models and assesses the integrity of those projects. And we have been extremely busy over the last quarter. This is just some of the highlights of the features that we provide. We are tracking all of the international transactions in this space between governments under Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. And we now have detailed analysis on what's going on inside countries in over 25 countries. That is super important because it affects not only the supply of carbon credits from often developing countries, but also the demand as well, as more governments start to implement compliance mechanisms where carbon credits can play a role. On the commitment side, we track over 10,000 firms in terms of their commitments to climate and carbon, their emissions profiles and their use of carbon credits. On the pricing side, we track over 4,000 individual projects and the OTC and exchange-based prices that reveal those transactions. We've got futures, we track the auctions, and also we've recently launched a new carbon dioxide engineered removals platform that keeps users informed of that emerging market space. On the forecasting side, we have a dedicated team that produces scenarios for how these prices may evolve in the future. And we recently launched an interactive version of the model that allows users to create their own scenarios, and up to 1,000 scenarios can be created by users on the platform. And on the transactions and project side, we have extremely detailed data across over 14 registries, daily updates and API feeds. And then the integrity assessment, we're building in a lot more analysis around the core carbon principles and how they are likely to affect the supply of credits. And we've recently launched a partnership with Chloris Earth, who have a lot of geospatial skills that we use in our work. And then last but not least, our nature-based team regularly analyzes the role of and the markets, the sub-markets for nature-based solutions, and the emerging market for jurisdictional level RED projects. And that's obviously connected with the Article 6 transaction database as well. And we're going to be doing more in aviation, for example, looking at Corsia and a number of other sub-markets that are sort of bubbling up and reshaping this market. So that's what we've been up to. We're very busy. And one final piece of information for those who've missed the news in the last week: we have now merged, been acquired by MSCI, the world's leading provider of financial indices and also ESG and climate data to the capital markets. And we are super excited to be able to join them and bring the expertise and data that we have on carbon markets to a much broader audience and really start to move capital in at scale. So super excited about that news, and watch this space for more interesting outcomes. And I'll hand over to my colleagues on the commitment side.
Perfect. So the voluntary carbon market relies on corporate demand, and we see not let up in the number of companies committing to take action. We see continued growth in the number of firms joining SBTi standards, as shown on the chart on the left. Last quarter, for example, 925 new companies had hired the climate targets validated by SBTi, who are committing to doing so in the following 2 years. The total number of companies signing up to SBTi is now over 6,000, with a cumulative market cap of around $34 trillion. This is actually approaching 50% of the global market cap for a viable sector, which is a remarkable achievement. During Q3, we saw the highest ever number of companies setting a 1.5-degree near-term target, as you can see in the chart at the right. A further of 163 firms are committed to the long-term net zero standard, taking this total to over 900 firms, making the strongest levels of commitment. We should note also that about 40% of the firms within SBTi are under the status of committed, which means they have not yet submitted any specific target for validation, a process that needs to happen within 2 years of commitments. Since inception, around 120 companies have allowed this period to lapse, including Amazon this last quarter, who announced difficulties of applying the SBTi methodologies to their business, although also stressed that they continue to collaborate. So overall, climate action and long-term credit demand through net zero have continued to increase this quarter, and we are seeing similar upward trends in issuances that Jamie will explain in the next slides.
Brilliant, thank you. So at the other end of the market, we've seen similarly strong trends in the early stage credit supply. So here is our tracker of pipeline activity, which shows the potential annual issuances of projects that are yet to register on the main credit registries and standards. Currently, pipeline capacity now stands at 844 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year, and has continued to accelerate, almost doubling in the last year and up 13% on Q2. Historically, pipeline growth has been driven by energy efficiency projects, namely cook stove projects across Africa, and this is represented here by the pink wedge that you can see on the chart. But we're now seeing the biggest driver of early stage project activity actually coming in the nature restoration sector. Nature restoration project share of pipeline capacity has grown almost fourfold in the last year and now stands at 260 megatons a year, accounting for almost a third of the project pipeline by volume. Similar growth patterns in the nature-based sector were also identified in our recent analysis of investment trends in the global carbon credit sector. Taking data from a market-wide survey, and over 400 public announcements of capital raises, and then modeling investment for over 7,000 projects, we estimated that around $36 billion has been invested in carbon projects over the last decade. Of this, $15 billion, around 40%, has been invested in nature restoration and RED+ project activities alone. This share increased to 50% in the last 3 years, amounting to almost $9 billion. But what impact is this recent surge of investment in nature likely to have on the climate and environment? So first, in terms of carbon emissions, the around 400 NBS projects that have registered since 2020 could save as much as 300 megatons a year, which is equivalent to the annual carbon emissions to the UK. Plus, of course, the 260 megatons that I just mentioned, potential issuances that could be delivered by nature-based projects awaiting registration. The investment is also helping to protect and enhance nature across the world by the 30 million hectares of forest that it now covers within the registered projects, and then a further 80 million which could come from pipeline projects. Since we published this analysis, roughly $300 million of raised capital has been announced for nature by Indigo and Mombach as well. So we'll continue to update this analysis, including other new market developments when we come around to reflecting on the market trends of 2023 later this year. Next slide, please. Thank you. In contrast to the continued growth of early stage projects activities that we've just seen in Q3, issuance behaviors have somewhat calmed. Last quarter saw a decrease in the number of credits being issued from 85 megatons in Q2 to 48 in Q3, which is the quietest quarter for 3 years. However, stepping back to the 205 megatons of credits that have been issued to date in 2023, we can see that this is just 8% behind 2022 levels. So the quarterly issuance volumes here represent the portion of verified credits that project developers have decided to issue to the market in a given quarter. Over 800 projects had registered by the end of Q3 this year, but only 36% have issued credits to date. In comparison, at this point last year, 82% of projects that had registered had issued credits, which to me indicates that for whatever reason, perhaps price, sentiment, changing standards or otherwise, it appears that developers aren't currently issuing all the credits that they could. But this by no means suggests the market is short on supply, with market surplus at an all-time high of 900 megatons. Already, this is composed of over half post-2018 vintages. Now, just a quick look back to the demand for carbon credits this quarter, which have mirrored the patient nature of the supply side. A modest 29 megatons of credits were retired in Q3, recording the lowest quarterly volume since Q3 2020, having decreased 22% from Q2. Retirements are also 17% lower year to date, but just 12% lower if you exclude kind of the spate of crypto retirements that occurred in the first half of 2022. Interestingly, though, in spite of the overall decline in retirement volumes and negative media sentiment around credit integrity, Red Plus retirements have remained relatively flat from Q2 to Q3. Plus, analysis of corporate buyers has shown that the number of companies retiring carbon credits during 2023 has still increased around 5% on 2022. I'll now let the corporate team explore more around what might be influencing the change in corporate behavior.
Thank you, Jamie. Well, we see 4 main drivers for retirements being lower than a year ago. The first one is the tight corporate budgets. So as we know, credits are a discretionary item, and the third economic situation in many geographies and sectors is putting a lot of pressure on corporate budgets and credits. The second reason is the concern over the accusations of greenwashing. Negative mainstream press this year has had an impact. Companies are nervous about being accused of doing the wrong thing and therefore might tend to reduce their planned use of credits. Thirdly is the concern over underlying integrity. Some action might be slower, stopped due to buyers lacking confidence in their ability to source high-quality credits. The last pressure is related to the changes in the regulation or the policy guidance. In Europe, for example, we see there have been a lot of discussion about the European Union plans to ban the unsupported carbon neutral claims, even with implementation is still a couple of years away. But we are sure that actually the regulation that has had the biggest near-term impact, and perhaps one of the less discussed, is the change in the Colombian carbon tax, which has reduced the proportion of emissions tax that can be offset with credits from 100% to 50% this year. But there are also a lot of positive trends beneath the headline numbers. First, there is a lot of work on the way to improve integrity of credits and reassure buyers that they will be having effective environmental impact, which might mitigate some of the perceived risk. Also, something really important to mention is that the vast bulk of difference in retirements from a year ago is primarily driven by a handful of large buyers. We have first Delta Airlines, the largest. They have made up to 12% of all retirements between 2020 and 2022. But we have few other well-covered names such as EasyJet, JetBlue, and Kering from Gucci. Referring back to the point about the Colombian carbon tax, the South American oil and gas firms, Primax, Biomax, and Terpel, have all made material fewer retirements this year too. And if we analyze all companies participating in the VCM, the numbers of companies using credits has actually increased this year. Looking at companies retiring more than 1,000 tons, we see that there are more companies starting to use carbon credits in 2023, so we have more joiners than the ones that appear to have a step back. There are a few big names in the group of new joiners, such as Petrobras, which made a large purchase retirement this last quarter, and Apple, which made headlines for making various products carbon neutral a month ago. Finally, we see some companies shifting their strategy. They will continue to invest, we know that, but in different ways. For example, an increased number of firms are choosing to invest directly in project development, in particular nature-based projects, and many other firms are investing in the small but fast-growing engineering removal or CDR market. We'll have a look at these emerging climate action approaches in the following slide. Many companies, including mega cap firms like Microsoft, JP Morgan, Airbus, and Amazon, have a strong interest in these carbon dioxide removal technologies, considering the huge impact it has to deliver sustained negative emissions in the long term. Over the past 3 years, we have seen more than 1,000 transactions registered, but mainly from buyers in North America and Europe. However, the volume of credits trade is still very low and is centered around biochar projects. It is important to mention that half of these volumes are forward agreements, so the transaction occurred before the project had even been issued credits. We know that this technology is in an early stage, and therefore it has a long process to achieve a major pipeline with the strong quality required. And we know that there are a lot of challenges. For example, governments will need to enforce regulation, and all the stakeholders will need to address all the challenges related with the infrastructure, clean energy sources, and accessibility of storage for this technology. This risk also presents a lot of opportunities for companies able to overcome the challenges, making it a hot topic of investment discussion. If you want to know more about the CDR, we have a complete database of historical sales and purchases type details and a monthly report with all market developments available for our subscribers in our Trove Intelligence platform. Over to you, Peter.
Carbon credit prices and volumes were lower in the third quarter. While normal summer diversions and the uncertain macroeconomic environment may have played a role, the same factors weighing on retirements have also assuredly impacted market activity. In particular, the ongoing wait for the application of CCPs to credits in the market and whether they will inject more clarity in credit quality and, more important, bolster buyers' confidence. Although it now looks like the market will have to wait a bit longer as implementation appears to have been pushed out to early 24. Volume, as reported to Trove, was down by more than half between Q2 and Q3 across all project types, particularly in the historically two largest sectors, RED+ and renewables. However, we did see a noticeable jump in September, perhaps due to some seasonal retirement demand, although still at relatively low levels for the year. This increase was particularly evident in renewable energy, where several large transactions in wind and solar credits were reported. We also observed a jump in RED+ volumes, especially in planned deforestation, which was at the highest monthly level for the year. Although just one data point, we nevertheless found this quite interesting given the market environment for RED+. As you can see on this slide, the average prices reported to Trove were lower in the third quarter, declining from a weighted average of $6.70 to $5, and particularly in September with a weighted average at $4.70. Prices were lower across all of the sectors except for energy efficiency credits, which were approximately unchanged. As of the end of September, we saw weighted average prices for nature restoration credits at approximately $12.50, RED+ at $6.50, energy efficiency at $6.80, non-CO2 gases at $3.30, and renewable energy at $2.30. However, we'd like to make two brief comments on our price and volume data. First, the prices and volumes reported to Trove, which come from a variety of sources, are largely based on spot trades or offers in the market. As just mentioned by my colleague Laura, there has been an increased shift in buyers taking early exposure in projects through direct investment and as well offtake and other forward agreements in order to have more transparency and control over the projects. We believe this burgeoning demand has absorbed some volume for periodic spot transactions and may partially account for some of the recent lower volumes reported to Trove. We plan to better capture this forward price data and would welcome suggestions or even contributions from many of the participants in this webinar. The other point we would like to emphasize is the construction of Trove's price indices, which are weighted by reported volumes for both transactions and offers. While we receive this data on a recurring basis, the data from individual contributors is typically not continuous and varies considerably in the number and size of transactions or offers week to week, which naturally increases the volatility of the Trove indices on a weekly basis and can also be seen in the monthly series. For example, if there are more and/or larger, richly priced and newer vintage blue and coastal carbon credits, or alternatively, older vintage and cheaply priced renewable energy credits. Similarly, within a sector, more or larger North American IFM credits, which tend to realize much higher prices than Chinese IFM credits. Consequently, as shown on this slide, we've opted to also show a series based on the simple average of prices over a month. While a price-weighted index can obviously also be impacted by relative price levels reported each week, it will not be affected by shifts in volumes, which tend to have a bigger impact. You can see this dynamic particularly in September, where, as I just mentioned, we observed a large number of renewable energy trades at extremely low prices, which dragged down the overall weighted index. In contrast, the simple average price series, aside from the swoon in July, which also is due to a shift in the mix of credits, shows that the market, at least as reflected by Trove data, has been more stable and at a higher level than shown by the weighted average series since last spring. And we've seen a similar pattern in different project sector prices as well. Next slide.
And so to round out our review of the quarter before we move into our deep dive on the policy landscape for the VCM, we're going to walk through some of the key developments in the policy and guidance area from Trove that we've seen this quarter. We'll be doing this through the lens of our headwinds, tailwinds, and crosswinds framework, but with a focus on the policy arena. Firstly, Africa Climate Week saw a high profile for carbon markets and attendance from a number of high-level decision makers, including secretaries of state and heads of state. Secondly, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, the ICVCM, released its assessment framework for credit categories, which we can broadly interpret as similar to project types. And while a lot will depend on how this framework is interpreted by the ICVCM's working groups, our headline assessment is that we think it'll be a rigorous but pragmatic approach for the market. From our analysis, which we've got a snapshot here, but you can read more about that on our website, the potential impact of the credit category assessment varies quite significantly between project type. But overall, with around 18% of projects being assessed to have a high likelihood of being CCP eligible, we see that there's potential for a material impact on the market here. Both of these we see as tailwinds. The growth in interest in carbon markets in Africa has significant benefits for growing international climate finance flows and reaching underserved communities. The CCPs, as seen by the ongoing media scrutiny of carbon credits, could have a very important role in providing a shared benchmark for credit integrity if there is an effective implementation and uptake from the market in terms of the registries and also buyers and sellers. Next, in September, the European Commission and the European Parliament reached a provisional agreement on amendments to EU consumer protection laws to classify carbon neutral and similar environmental claims that are based on the use of carbon credits as a misleading practice. We see this as a crosswind. As we highlighted in our last webinar, the ideas around carbon neutral claims are under threat. But this regulation is likely to weed out a number of unscrupulous practices relating to this that could, if allowed to continue, undermine confidence in carbon credits. However, the missing piece is a shared understanding of what kinds of claims companies should make instead, and how they can incentivize, how these kinds of claims can also incentivize climate action as carbon neutral claims did. We also saw big steps forward for domestic credit standards and exchanges for the voluntary carbon market in Asia. The most significant being the imminent relaunch of the CCER program in China, but new carbon exchanges are opening in Japan, Indonesia, Malaysia, and elsewhere in the region. We also saw movement on emission trading schemes in countries in Latin America, including Brazil, Mexico, and an ETS proposal is expected soon in Colombia, which we rate as a crosswind given the uncertainties around the timelines for the implementation of these and what might the overall impact on project-based credits be. Finally, we are continuing to see countries deliberating or taking action to increase oversight or regulatory control on carbon credits. We see this as a headwind, given the potential restrictions on trading or the implementation of high impact revenue sharing provisions. But more broadly, for the uncertainty associated with these developments, as seen in how the process around the development of these regulations has proceeded in Zimbabwe and Kenya, for example. Overall, what we see in the policy space is there is a lot of action right now, but many of these are positive developments, and others with the crosswinds may be causing shorter-term disruption, but could contribute to the maturation and growth of the market in the longer term. But as we see with policy taking up half of this slide here, we want to dig a bit further into these developments in the rest of today's session, in line with our theme overall on countries shaping the carbon market landscape. So we want to dive in first into what are the key trends driving why countries are taking action at this time. Firstly, countries are getting ever more serious in understanding how they'll meet their climate goals and their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement, and what role carbon pricing, carbon markets, and the international trading of emissions reductions will take within that. And how does this influence the VCM? Well, we see that countries are introducing registries to track credits and projects, and understand the impact of these on their climate targets. Some countries are going further by imposing trading restrictions by either short-term or longer term, while they understand how they're going to meet their 2030 NDC targets. And some countries are going a step further in introducing broader regulation to take greater oversight of the VCM in order to support these NDC or Article 6 policies. Secondly, we can certainly say that countries are reacting to the scrutiny that carbon credits have faced in the past 18 months or so. Some of the impacts on the VCM that we see here are the imposition of regulatory benefit sharing arrangements, as seen in Kenya or Tanzania, but governments, bodies in Mexico too, for example, are interested in ensuring that carbon deals with local communities and indigenous peoples are fair. Countries continue to explore jurisdictional approaches, principally related to forestry through trees, the Leaf Coalition, and other initiatives, but also jurisdictional approaches to generating credits from the clean energy transition at the jurisdictional level based on policy are in the works. And countries are also increasing oversight on the use of credits in corporate claims, with examples including the EU, the UK's Advertising Standards Authority, and the US. And the third trend is that countries are looking to understand and identify opportunities to trade via Article 6, whether that's to help them meet their climate goals as buyer countries, or to generate revenue, inward investment, or contributions to their own sustainable development objectives as seller or host countries. And how does this influence the VCM then, as these are country-to-country deals? Well, buying countries, when it comes to the Article 6 bilateral agreements between countries, will have a significant role to play in how to define credit integrity and what credits will be permitted within the terms of that deal, and therefore what role carbon credits will play within Article 6.2. And secondly, host countries are looking for delivery partners, either to help them build the capacity to participate in bilateral agreements or the Article 6.4 mechanism, or to implement specific projects under the agreements that they're looking to sign with buyer countries. But certainly we'll learn more about these questions at COP28, and we'll highlight some of the key issues that we'll be keeping an eye on between now and then at the end of our time today.
As a response to these trends, countries have been very active among three main areas: Article 6.2 agreements, carbon pricing, domestic markets, and national exchanges, and introducing carbon trading regulations. This is a non-exhaustive picture of what countries are doing, just to give a sense of how complicated the environment has become. You can find detailed information of each country in our country profiles. For Article 6.2 agreements, we've seen that most Latin American countries are taking a more conservative approach. They have decided first to figure out how they will achieve their NDCs before jumping into signing Article 6.2 agreements and committing to sell some of their emissions reductions. When we look into Asia Pacific for carbon pricing, domestic markets, and national exchanges, we find that they are using all these types of mechanisms with different levels of ambition depending on the countries. Latin American countries, on the other hand, are focusing more on carbon pricing mechanisms. There are various carbon taxes in place in the region, and a considerable amount of countries are working on their emission trading systems. In Africa and Middle East, there's only one carbon pricing mechanism fully implemented, the South Africa's carbon tax. On the other hand, they have been working on various national exchanges, which we've seen emerging since the last year. Supplier countries in all regions are working on different types of carbon trading regulations. In most cases, these regulations are increasing uncertainty, mostly because of how it has been handled in countries like Zimbabwe, and because it adds extra administrative and economic burdens for projects. Nevertheless, if it is handled correctly, engaging stakeholders throughout the whole regulatory process and balancing out the need for oversight, but without risking hindering investment, regulations can also provide more legal certainty and integrity. I will provide more examples of different regulations and their levels of impact as I dive deeper into these three areas. Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement created a decentralized mechanism in which countries can negotiate bilaterally the transfer of carbon credits, called an International Transfer Mitigation Outcome, or ITMOS. We have categorized these different agreements into 5 categories, depending on its alignment with Article 6.2 rules and how binding the agreement is. Transactions from the last quarter mainly focus on defining pilot activities. What we can see from our tracker is that intentions to cooperate are taking less of a spotlight now compared to what was happening the same quarter last year. Countries are now advancing from finding partners to selecting projects they can authorize in the future. As these are still pilot projects, it is also a sign that Article 6.2 transactions continue to be at an early stage. Another interesting trend to highlight is that there has been an increase in upfront investment from buying countries to implement those pilot projects that is being delivered through those, or it's being agreed upon through the cooperation agreements. In the last quarter, there also has been an increase of announcement from actors different from countries, trying to identify the opportunities for Article 6.2 transactions. Some examples are UAE's base Blue Carbon, which has signed deals with different African countries, but it's not clear if the UAE government is backing up these agreements. And another example is the Rainforest Coalition, which announced that it intends to sell ITMOS from countries that don't have any Article 6.2 cooperation agreement in place or have even announced an intention to cooperate. It is not clear how these private initiatives will align with Article 6.2. This is something that we'll be looking closely at. Lastly, we expect to see new agreements or updates on previous announcements continue to grow in the fourth quarter before COP kicks off. Countries are looking at how carbon pricing mechanisms can support their climate strategy and how they achieve their NDC. Broadly, we can categorize this in 3 different groups regarding how much control and oversight they take. This will influence the impact of regulations on developers and projects. The regulatory approach with the lowest oversight and control is establishing a carbon exchange. This allows the country to have an oversight of the market and generate some kind of revenue from the transactions without directly interfering in the market with regulations. Here we have some of the recently created or expanded exchanges. For the interest of time, I will highlight the recently announced partnership between the Zimbabwe-based Victoria Falls Carbon Registry and CTX, which launched a Pan-African registry to enhance efforts to boost the African carbon markets. Stepping up on the level of control and oversight are the domestic carbon credit standards for national carbon markets. These standards control the project types and methodologies that they allow for, and can include new requirements for carbon projects. But it can also strengthen the national carbon market if well connected with international markets. Thailand, for example, is working to transform the Thailand voluntary emission reduction program into a globally accepted standard. The stronger regulatory approach are compliance markets. With these mechanisms, countries are taking control of their climate strategy. They define the amount of emissions that want to reduce, and in the case of an ETS, set a cap for what they want to achieve through the system. In the last quarter, the ETS proposal has continued to move its way through the Congress in Brazil. Colombia has published that it will release draft ETS regulations by the end of the year, and the Mexican ETS announced that it will push back its operational phase until next year. Lastly, we have carbon trading regulations. Next slide, please. These regulations are emerging from different policy initiatives and reflect the key policy trends. This is meeting NDC targets, taking greater oversight of projects to tackle low integrity claims, and creating conditions to maximize Article 6 opportunities. Some of these regulations have gained a lot of attention in recent months because of the negative impacts that it can have on developers and investors, especially when these regulations impact ongoing projects without proper stakeholder engagement and a consistent regulatory process. Here, we've tiered some of the regulations by their impact on projects. In Indonesia, restrictions have a high impact. All exports of credits must be approved by the government and retain a percentage that's still unconfirmed of credits for the achievement of Indonesia's NDC. In Kenya, also high impact draft regulation mandates a 25% minimum benefit sharing scheme between developers and local communities. Zimbabwe, which has had a lot of media cover for their changes in direction with this specific regulations. The last update only includes a 30% revenue sharing provision, which is not something which is actually very high, but they took up the extra 25% for community sharing. Paraguay recently approved a carbon market regulation with a medium impact for projects. It includes NDC buffer pool from 3 to 10% credit. Zambia has also been working on a pilot scheme, which is medium impact for now, but if roll out countrywide, it could become of high impact. Finally, Ghana is a good example on how regulations can be beneficial for carbon investment by providing more legal certainty and integrity. As part of their Article 6 framework, it includes a 1% NDC buffer pool, which is a reasonable requirement to ensure meeting their own climate targets, as well as benefiting from international finance through carbon markets. Different regulations or the lack of regulations pose risk for carbon investment. Today, we've touched upon some of the main risks in the main supplier countries, but there are also many opportunities, such as ambitious NDCs with low capacity to implement, gaps between ambition and implementation of forest sector targets, and social and environmental co-benefits. We provide a comprehensive ranking with granular analysis for countries that account for more than 80% of the total supply in our VCM Opportunity and Risk Index available on the platform. Back to you, Lucien.
Thanks, Juan. And so to sum up things up, we just wanted to highlight some of the key discussions at COP28 that we'll be keeping our eye on. Firstly, there are several important discussions around the governance and the rules for Article 6.2, which will be on the table. These include what level of confidentiality countries can assert over those agreements and what can be made confidential, and also how, when, and if countries can pull out of Article 6.02 agreements once they're signed, reviewed, and lodged with the UNFCCC. There are a number of key decisions to be taken around how methodologies for different project types will be reviewed for the Article 6.4 mechanism, which is the key thing to unlock how, for us to understand what projects may be part of Article 6.4. There's a strong interest from the United Arab Emirates as the presidents of COP28 in terms of removals and carbon capture and storage technologies, and so we'll be watching for what role those take in the negotiations. And finally, as a barometer of where countries' ambition is in terms of the language around fossil fuels and their reaction to the progress that's been assessed in the global stocktake, we'll be keeping an eye on what language around fossil fuels and fossil fuel phase out is included in the outcome document, and what this says about where countries may be going with future NDCs. Finally, there's some other key updates that we'll be watching in the policy sphere that we'll be keeping an eye out for, which is the Beyond Value Chain Mitigation position paper from the Science Based Targets Institute. We're looking for Vera to release the consolidated RED methodology. The VCMI, the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, announced that on the 28th of November next month, they will be releasing further guidance for the Claims Code of Practice, which will allow companies to start submitting claims for verification and validation. And finally, as discussed recently at Carbon Forward, the ICVCM is targeting the publication of the first tagged credits with CCB eligibility for early 2024.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Lucian. Thanks, team. Yes, so this is our favorite part of the webinar, where we ask you on what your views of carbon prices will be at year end. So get your fingers ready on the poll. Team, can we bring up, Irina, can we bring up the question?
Indeed. Thank you, Guy. You should now be able to see the poll popping up on your screen. Please share with us your predictions for where you believe carbon credit prices will stand at the end of this year for renewable energy, clean cooking, RED+, and nature restoration projects. You will need to scroll down to be able to see all questions, and please select one answer for each question. Let's give the audience a couple of moments. I guess in the meantime, Guy, perhaps you could share with us your predictions for COP28. We did hear our policy team and Lucian. Would you mind sharing your views as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. Thanks, Irina. It's difficult to sort of predict. For those of us who've sort of been attending sort of the COP processes for the last 20 years, things move sort of at glacial pace. We get a lot of joy and celebrate small wins, and I think I wouldn't expect there to be any sort of dramatic movements. I'd love to see that, but I also think the spotlight is going to be very much on the hosts, being the role that the countries, the oil states in the Middle East play in the global energy system is unprecedented as a host. They control such vast quantities of the world's oil and gas reserves and have such an influence on the global market that I think the world will be watching and very keen to see whether that influence they have is used in the true spirit of what the UNFCCC is trying to achieve. And I don't want to predict it, but I am hopeful that that responsibility will be met with action in the right direction, and that the world will be moved forward through their intentions rather than sort of stagnate or move backwards. That is a hope rather than a prediction. I think Lucian and the team talked about the specific points that are going to be on the table, but just as a sort of a more general backdrop, that's my hope. We will be there in force with our new MSCI colleagues, so we'll be looking forward to joining forces on this and many other things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Guy. Whilst we're waiting for the poll results, perhaps we could share another question from the chat. There have been actually a few questions about the overall project composition. Perhaps my colleague Jamie Lambert could expand on the relative sizing of nature-based solutions versus renewables, for example. Jamie, would you be able to share your views?
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question. I think speaking to the growth of nature restoration, I think obviously there's interest in where that sits amongst other project types now. Particularly compared to renewables, when you look at that pipeline capacity now, you're seeing nature restoration projects that are not only greater in number in the pipeline, but then they're also typically greater in size than renewable energy projects also. So that's why you're getting such a disparity. REDD+ in particular, which is usually now filling up in LATAM and sub-Saharan Africa countries. That's where that growth is. Whereas renewables, there, as you can see in that chart back on slide 6, you'll be able to see that the growth of renewables over time has not changed at all compared to nature restoration. In terms of registered projects,
firstly, potential issuances are what are being shown in pipeline capacity, and also renewables are just not coming into the pipeline across the major registries. Energy efficiency as well, as I spoke to, used to take up most of the growth, still upholds the largest share of pipeline. And this is largely down to not particularly big projects, but just the sheer number of projects that have been kind of deployed and are awaiting registration, which sits at about over 1,200 now.
Great, thank you, very, very insightful. Thank you, Jamie. I think we are ready to share the results from the poll. And 1, 2, 3.
So
over to you.
Yeah, today's webinar. So this is a process that I talk about on previous webinars, and this is a trend that we've observed over the last 4 quarters. So you can see the split by renewable energy, clean cooking, and REDD+, and nature restoration in the 6 price buckets that we asked you to comment on. And you can see in renewable energy now 60%. It's gone up from 55 to sort of 60% of you are believing that the renewable energy credits are going to continue the sort of low price trajectory in the 3 to 6 range. We didn't have a 0 to 3 bucket, I have to say. But that actually, you know, in the at the start of the year in Q1, you thought that, you know, it was a 50 sort of 3% chance that renewable energy would be in that range, and now it's gone up to 60. So definitely a skew to the left, renewable energy continuing its downward price trajectory. Clean cooking is probably now is looking like one of the areas that's had the most marked change in expectations. 40% now believe in the 3 to 6 range, whereas previously it was in the 25% range. Now that's probably in reaction to some of the studies that have been published on the quantification of the carbon credits from those types of projects, which I know has had a material effect on the market for those types of credits. But still the same, you know, roughly the same, more than 40% of you believe that the prices could end up in the 7 to 10 range, and you know, a tail then distributing down into the sort of 11 to 14 and 15 to 18 range, sort of in diminishing quantities. So now these are typically sort of Poisson type distributions with a left tail, with a left skew. REDD+, that's another one that's jumped in the lower range, the 3 to 6. So the 3 to 6 range has gone up from 30% to over 40%. And actually in the 7 to 10% has actually just marginally ticked up, but is still in the noise around 40%. And I think the spread again, you know, there's then a declining tail towards 11 to 14 and up to 18 and over 20. And I think, you know, these are very broad buckets, and they hide a multitude of other sub-project types. So it is a very broad question that we ask. So these are very generalized results, and some of those higher price points probably reflect people's perceptions of where those sub-markets, so for afforestation, you know, indigenous species type projects would command much higher project prices. Sorry. And then in nature restoration, yes, a material sort of, more of a normal distribution here around the 11 to 14, around the 14 price point. Increasing sort of left tail sort of skew from compared to last quarter. In particular, I suppose the 23 to $26 bracket compared to last quarter, dropping from 25% to under 10%, and that weight of opinion shifting towards the sub $10 bracket. So a downward movement across the complex, but still pockets of interest and expectations of higher price projects, probably on a selective basis, depending on the characteristics of those individual projects. So that brings us to the end. Do we want to sort of take up any more questions, Irina?
Indeed, we do have a couple of additional questions, and specifically one for Lucien. There have been a few questions around the Green Directive and the Consumer Empowerment Law. So any clarity, when is clarity to be expected, Lucien? And how do these link, I guess? There is another related question.
Yeah, sure. So that's, I think, one of the slightly confusing aspects about this is that earlier this year, we had the Commission propose the Green Claims Prospectus Directive, and the EU Parliament responded to that with a number of amendments that would make that law more stringent. However, the announcement that we had last month was in relation to several amendments to EU consumer protection law, which were jointly called together, empowering consumers for the green transition. So that's the thing we highlighted earlier on this slide. So within that, the Commission and the Parliament has agreed on several of the amendments that were proposed by the Parliament, which one of the most impactful here for our audience today is a ban on generic environmental claims where they're based on offsetting of environmental impacts, principally the use of carbon credits. And so that there needs to be a final vote in the Parliament on that, and then it will be discussed at the next Council of Ministers. And then if the Council of Ministers also agree to this, then it will become EU law, and countries will have 24 months to then put that into their own consumer protection laws. And so from that point, 2 years from when it becomes EU law, then there will be an end really to carbon neutral claims within Europe where they're based on credits. And so the parallel process is then we need to understand how the EU is going to assess and verify or create a framework in which countries can then verify other environmental claims that are not carbon neutral based on carbon credits. But I think that's the important thing to note is that these two processes going on, and it's not banning the use of carbon credits, it's banning the use of carbon credits to claim a reduced positive or neutral impact on the environment.
Thank you so much, Lucien. We have time for one more question for Guy. Guy, what is the outlook for the CDR market and technologies? And how do you think forward pricing arrangement or discounts or challenges for buyers might play out?
Yeah, the CDR market is one of the bright spots in the whole market. It's being led by the more wealthy, passionate sort of firms, particularly in the US, the technology firms, who are really genuinely keen to mitigate their climate impact that they've had in the world, and they see the permanence is a really important aspect of that, sort of to take the CO2 out of the atmosphere that has been put in there and lock it up, for in perpetuity. And that is a very different sort of use case for the concept of a carbon credit, to compare to sort of other firms that are trying to sort of incrementally sort of reduce their impact as they go through their their businesses on a daily, on a yearly basis. And I think those CDR projects play are the only way that those needs can be met. Are they scalable? They're very costly. I don't know. I think we'll have to wait and see just how far the technologies can come down. Particularly the more advanced engineering ones. Biochar, we do a lot of work around the biochar market. We have our own price forecast for the biochar based on individual company demand and our engineering cost models that model the supply. And I think we'd like to see a reasonable amount of movement in that market. For the more sort of like the direct air capture, bioenergy with CCS type projects, I think we've still got a long way to go before we really start to hit sort of cost reductions. And even if we don't, though, I still think that they will serve a valuable purpose for the firms that are interested in those particular project types.
Thank you so much, Guy. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is all we have time for, unfortunately. We hope you'll join us next time for our next session in Q1. Apologies for any questions we couldn't answer in the chat. If you're a subscriber, please do reach out to us. After the webinar ends, a survey will be available in your browser. We greatly appreciate your feedback, so please take a moment to respond to the survey if you can. As a reminder, all slides and the recording of this webinar will be available for download on our website by the end of this week. If you're interested to learn more about the Trove Intelligence platform, please do get in touch with our team at Trove at info@troveresearch.com. And please follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter for future webinars and the latest insights on the voluntary carbon markets. Thank you, and see you again very soon. Thank you, everyone.